The summer sun blazed over London as thousands of tourists gathered outside Buckingham Palace. It was one of those perfect August afternoons when the city felt alive with excitement and energy. Families with children, couples taking photos, and travelers from every corner of the world stood shoulder to shoulder, all waiting for the same thing. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and nobody wanted to miss it. Among the crowd stood a young boy with sandy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. He wore simple clothes, a navy polo shirt and khaki shorts, trying his best to blend in with everyone else. This was Prince George, the future King of England, but today he was just another curious 10-year-old watching the guards. His protection officers stood nearby, dressed in casual clothes, keeping a careful but distant watch. They had learned that sometimes the best security was the kind nobody noticed. Prince George had begged his parents for this trip. He wanted to see the ceremony like a normal person, not from behind palace walls or through a car window. He wanted to stand in the crowd, feel the excitement, and understand what tourists saw when they visited his family's home. His father, Prince William, had hesitated at first, but his mother, Catherine, had smiled and said it might be good for him. So here he was, living a small moment of ordinary life in his very extraordinary world. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of drums and bagpipes. The guards marched in perfect formation, their red tunics bright against the gray stone of the palace. Their tall bearskin hats made them look even more impressive and mysterious. The crowd pressed forward, everyone trying to get a better view, phones and cameras held high in the air. George watched with fascination, noticing details he had never seen before. The precise movements, the serious expressions on the guards' faces, the way they never seemed to blink or look at the crowd. Near the front of the gathering, one guard stood particularly still. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with a stern expression fixed on his face. His name was James Mitchell, though nobody in the crowd knew that. He had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 2 years, and this duty at Buckingham Palace was both an honor and a challenge. Standing motionless for hours while hundreds of people stared, took photos, and sometimes tried to make you laugh was harder than it looked. As the ceremony continued, George noticed something that made him uncomfortable. A group of men near the front barriers were acting strangely. They were loud and stumbling, clearly drunk despite it being only early afternoon. There were 4 of them, all appearing to be in their 30s, wearing football jerseys and carrying beer cans poorly hidden in paper bags. They were shouting jokes at the guards, trying to get reactions, laughing too loudly at their own comments. Most of the crowd tried to ignore them, shifting away slightly and exchanging uncomfortable glances. Parents pulled their children closer. Tourists who had traveled thousands of miles for this moment looked disappointed that their photos were being ruined by these disruptive men. But the guards, as trained, showed no reaction whatsoever. They continued their duty as if the drunken men did not exist at all. One of the drunk men, wearing a stained white England jersey, seemed to take the guard's silence as a personal challenge. He stumbled closer to the barrier, pointing at Guard Mitchell and making rude gestures. His friends laughed and encouraged him, their voices cutting through the ceremonial music. Security officers began moving toward them, but the crowd was so thick that it was difficult to get through quickly. George felt his heart beating faster. He had been taught about duty and service his entire life. His great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had told him stories about staying calm under pressure, about the responsibility that came with their position. He watched the young guard's face and saw something that most people missed. There was a tiny flicker in his eyes, a brief moment of frustration or perhaps hurt, before his expression returned to perfect stillness. The drunk man was now shouting directly at Guard Mitchell, calling him names, making fun of his uniform, his hat, his stillness. He reached over the barrier, trying to touch the guard's rifle. The crowd gasped. This was crossing a serious line. The other guards remained in position, unable to break formation during the ceremony, but everyone could feel the tension rising. Security was still pushing through the crowd, but they were not there yet. What happened next would change everything. Prince George, this young boy who could have stayed silent and invisible, who could have let the adults handle it, made a decision. He began moving through the crowd, his small size allowing him to slip between people more easily than the security officers could. His protection team noticed and began following, speaking urgently into their radios. But George was already at the front. The drunk man had grabbed Guard Mitchell's rifle, trying to pull it, still laughing as if this was all a grand joke. His friends were filming on their phones, enjoying what they thought was hilarious entertainment. The crowd had gone quiet, shocked and unsure what to do. This was the moment when George reached the barrier, his young voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "Excuse me, sir," George said, his voice clear and polite but firm. "You need to stop that right now." The drunk man turned, surprised to see a child speaking to him. He blinked, trying to focus his blurry vision on this small boy in a polo shirt. The entire crowd seemed to hold its breath, wondering what would happen next. Wondering who this brave child was who dared to speak up when hundreds of adults had stayed silent. George stood straight, his blue eyes meeting the man's gaze without fear, without anger, just with a quiet determination that seemed far beyond his years. The protection officers were almost there, but for this one suspended moment it was just a young prince and a drunk troublemaker, facing each other across a barrier while the whole world watched. The drunk man stared at George with confusion spreading across his flushed face. He still had one hand on Guard Mitchell's rifle, but his grip had loosened slightly. His friends had stopped laughing, sensing that something had shifted in the atmosphere. The cameras around them kept recording, but now they were focused on the small boy who had stepped forward when no one else would. "What did you say to me, kid?" the man slurred, releasing the rifle and leaning over the barrier toward George. His breath smelled of alcohol and his eyes struggled to focus. "You telling me what to do? Where are your parents?" George did not step back. He had been taught never to show fear, especially when doing the right thing. His mother had once told him that courage was not about being the biggest or the strongest, but about standing up when others could not stand up for themselves. Right now, this young guard could not defend himself, could not speak, could not move. Someone had to speak for him. "This guard is doing his job, sir," George said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "He serves our country with honor. What you are doing is disrespectful and it needs to stop." People in the crowd began to murmur. Some pulled out their phones and started recording. Others whispered to each other, asking if anyone knew who this remarkably composed child was. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself that seemed unusual for a boy his age. His accent was refined, his vocabulary careful, his posture straight and confident. One of the drunk man's friends, slightly less intoxicated than the others, suddenly grabbed his arm. "Mate, we should go," he said nervously, his eyes darting between George and the security officers who were now very close. "This is not worth it. Let's just leave." But the man in the England jersey was too drunk and too stubborn to listen. He had been embarrassed by a child in front of hundreds of people, and his pride was wounded. He pointed a shaking finger at George, his face growing redder. "You think you're better than me, kid? You think you can talk to me like that? I paid good money to be here. I can do what I want." "No, sir, you cannot," George replied calmly. "These guards protect all of us. They stand here in the heat, unable to move or speak, doing their duty. The least we can do is show them respect. That is what being British means. That is what being a decent human being means." The crowd erupted in applause. It started with just a few people clapping, then spread like wildfire through the hundreds gathered there. People cheered and some shouted their agreement. An elderly woman near George reached down and gently touched his shoulder, her eyes shining with tears of pride at this young boy's bravery. Guard Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but those who looked closely could see the slightest change in his expression. The tension in his jaw had softened. The frustration in his eyes had transformed into something else, perhaps gratitude or respect. He could not acknowledge the boy who had defended him, but his rigid posture seemed to ease just a fraction. The security officers finally reached the scene. Two of them immediately moved to escort the drunk men away from the barrier. The troublemakers did not resist much, perhaps because they realized they had lost this battle the moment a child had shown more courage and dignity than they had. As they were led away, some in the crowd booed them, while others simply shook their heads in disapproval. George's protection officers also arrived, flanking him protectively. They did not grab him or make a scene, but their presence was suddenly very visible. One of them, a tall woman named Sarah with kind eyes, leaned down and whispered, "Your Highness, we need to move you to a safer location." That whisper, though quiet, was heard by several people standing nearby. "Your Highness." The words rippled through the crowd like electricity. Phones that had been recording the confrontation now zoomed in on George's face. People began frantically searching the internet on their devices, looking up photos of the royal children. The resemblance was undeniable once you knew what you were looking for. "Is that Prince George?" someone asked loudly. "Oh my God, it is him! The prince defended the guard!" The murmur became a wave of excited chatter. The crowd pressed closer, everyone wanting to see, to get a photo, to be part of this incredible moment. More security appeared, forming a protective circle around George. The situation was becoming complicated. What had started as a quiet outing for a young boy had turned into a major public event. But before the security could move him away, George did something that surprised everyone. He turned to Guard Mitchell and, despite knowing the guard could not respond, spoke directly to him. "Thank you for your service, sir. I am sorry that man bothered you. You are doing a wonderful job, and you make our country proud." The guard's eyes flickered downward for just a millisecond, breaking protocol ever so slightly to acknowledge the young prince's words. It was the smallest movement, invisible to most, but George saw it and understood. He smiled, and then allowed his security team to guide him through the crowd. As they moved away, the crowd parted respectfully. People were still taking photos and videos, but now their faces showed something different. Not just excitement at seeing a royal, but genuine admiration for what this young boy had done. He had not used his title or his position to make the drunk men leave. He had simply spoken with respect and courage, treating the guard as a fellow human being deserving of dignity. An American tourist, a middle-aged teacher from Texas, turned to her husband with tears streaming down her face. "Did you see that?" she asked. "That child is 10 years old, and he has more integrity than most adults I know. He stood up for someone who could not stand up for himself. That is what a real leader looks like." Her husband nodded, recording the scene on his phone. "This is going to be everywhere," he said. "Wait until people see this. That kid just changed how the world sees him." He had no idea how right he was. At that very moment, dozens of videos were being uploaded to social media. Tourists from Japan, Australia, Germany, Brazil, and every corner of the globe had captured the scene from different angles. The footage was being shared, retweeted, and reposted at an incredible speed. Within minutes, the story was trending worldwide. Meanwhile, Guard Mitchell continued his duty. The ceremony proceeded as planned, though nothing felt quite the same. The other guards had seen what happened, and word was spreading among them through subtle glances and tiny nods. One of their own had been harassed, and a 10-year-old prince had stepped up to defend him. It was unprecedented, touching, and deeply moving. As George was escorted to a waiting vehicle, he looked back one more time at the palace, at the guards, at the crowd that had witnessed everything. He hoped he had done the right thing. He had not planned any of this. He had simply seen something wrong and felt compelled to speak up. His great-grandmother's words echoed in his mind once again. "We are here to serve, not to be served." The vehicle door closed, and George sat back in the seat, his heart still racing from the adrenaline. Sarah, his protection officer, sat beside him with a complicated expression on her face. "Your parents are going to hear about this very quickly, Your Highness," she said, though her tone was not scolding. "You put yourself in a potentially dangerous situation." George nodded, understanding the concern. "I know," he said quietly, "but that guard needed someone to help him, and I was there." "Does that make sense?" Sarah looked at this remarkable young boy and felt her heart swell with respect. "Yes, Your Highness," she said softly. "It makes perfect sense. You did something very brave today. Very brave indeed." Neither of them knew it yet, but the story of what had happened outside Buckingham Palace was about to become one of the most talked-about events of the year, inspiring millions and forever changing how people viewed the young prince who would one day be king. The video exploded across the internet like nothing anyone had seen before. Within 2 hours of the incident, the hashtag Prince George Defends was trending in 74 countries. News organizations from BBC to CNN, from Al Jazeera to ABC Australia, were scrambling to verify the footage and get the story on air. Social media platforms could barely keep up with the millions of shares, comments, and reactions pouring in from every corner of the world. At Kensington Palace, Prince William and Catherine were in a meeting when their private secretary rushed in with a tablet. The color had drained from her face and her hands were trembling slightly. "Your Royal Highnesses, you need to see this immediately," she said, placing the device on the table between them. William and Catherine watched the video in stunned silence. They saw their son, their eldest child, standing firm before a drunk man twice his size. They heard his voice, clear and respectful but unwavering, defending a guard who could not defend himself. They watched the crowd's reaction, the applause, the moment when his identity was revealed. When the video ended, they looked at each other with a mixture of emotions impossible to describe. "He went to see the ceremony," Catherine whispered, her hand over her mouth. "He said he wanted to experience it like a normal child." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of anger or fear. They were tears of overwhelming pride mixed with concern for what this might mean for their son's future. William replayed the video, focusing on George's face. He saw his mother's compassion in those eyes, his great-grandmother's sense of duty in that straight posture. "He did the right thing," William said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Given the same situation, I would hope to have his courage. But he is so young, Kate, so very young to be thrust into the spotlight like this." Their phones began ringing simultaneously. Palace officials, security teams, family members, government representatives, everyone wanted to discuss what had happened and what should be done about it. The couple looked at each other, making a silent agreement. Before they dealt with any of the outside concerns, they needed to talk to their son. Meanwhile, at a modest apartment in South London, guard James Mitchell had just finished his shift and removed his ceremonial uniform. He sat on his worn sofa in track pants and an old t-shirt, scrolling through his phone in disbelief. His commanding officer had called him aside after the ceremony to tell him what had happened, but seeing the videos was something else entirely. The young prince, a boy he had seen in newspapers and on television countless times, had defended him. James came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a nurse. He had joined the army at 18, wanting to serve his country and make his parents proud. Being selected for the prestigious duty at Buckingham Palace had been the highlight of his military career. But standing there, enduring harassment from drunk tourists, had made him question sometimes whether it was worth it. Now, reading the comments under the videos, seeing messages from people around the world praising both him and the young prince, James felt emotions he had not expected. A professional soldier trained to be tough found himself wiping tears from his eyes. His phone buzzed with messages from his mother, his sister, his old school friends. Everyone had seen the videos. Everyone was talking about it. One comment in particular struck him deeply. It was from a teenager in Canada who wrote, "I used to think the royal guards were just tourist attractions like statues, but seeing how Prince George defended this guard made me realize they are real people doing a real job. They deserve respect. This kid taught me something important today." That message had 17,000 likes and had been shared across multiple platforms. James realized that what Prince George had done was bigger than just defending one guard from one drunk tourist. The young prince had reminded the world that behind the uniforms and the ceremony, the guards were human beings serving their country with honor. Back at Buckingham Palace, the official response was being carefully crafted. The king's press secretary was in intense discussions with various advisors about how to handle the situation. Some argued for a minimal response, letting the incident fade naturally. Others felt a statement was necessary to acknowledge what had happened. The debate was complicated by the fact that Prince George was still a child, and there were long-standing protocols about protecting royal children from excessive public attention. Across the ocean in New York, morning television shows were leading with the story. Good Morning America showed the video on repeat, with hosts praising the young prince's character and discussing what it meant for the future of the British monarchy. One of the hosts, a former military officer himself, became emotional on air while describing what it meant for someone to defend a guard who could not break protocol to defend himself. "This is not just about royalty or privilege," he said to millions of viewers. "This is about a child who saw something wrong and chose to speak up." In a world where people often film bad things happening on their phones without intervening, this 10-year-old boy stepped forward. He did not know those cameras were watching. He did not do it for attention. He did it because it was right. In schools across Britain, teachers were showing the video to their students as a lesson in courage and citizenship. A primary school in Liverpool held an impromptu assembly, where the headmaster talked about standing up to bullies and defending those who cannot defend themselves. "You do not need to be a prince or a princess to do the right thing," he told the children. Prince George showed us that real courage is not about your title or your position. It is about your character. Online, people were sharing their own stories of times they had or had not stood up for others. The incident had sparked a global conversation about bystander intervention, about respect, about duty. Psychologists and social commentators were being interviewed on news channels, discussing the powerful example Prince George had set for young people everywhere. Not everyone was positive, of course. Some critics argued that the palace was somehow behind the incident, staging it for positive publicity. These conspiracy theories were quickly dismissed when multiple independent tourists came forward with their own footage from different angles, all showing the same spontaneous events. Others questioned whether a child should have been allowed near a potentially dangerous situation, sparking debates about royal security protocols. But the overwhelming majority of responses were positive and often deeply emotional. Parents wrote about showing the video to their children and discussing what it meant to stand up for others. Veterans and active military personnel shared the footage with messages of gratitude that someone had defended one of their own. Teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters, and people in all types of service positions expressed appreciation that a young royal had acknowledged the dignity of public service. By evening, the video had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. It had been translated into dozens of languages, discussed on news programs on every continent, and become one of the most shared pieces of content in social media history. The image of a small boy in a polo shirt standing up to a man 3 times his size had become iconic almost instantly. At Kensington Palace, William and Catherine finally sat down with George in his bedroom. He was still wearing the same navy polo and khaki shorts from earlier, sitting cross-legged on his bed and looking worried. He knew his parents had seen the videos. He knew the whole world had seen them. He was not sure if he was in trouble or not. "George," William began gently, sitting beside his son. "We saw what happened today outside the palace." George looked down at his hands. "I know I was supposed to stay unnoticed," he said quietly. "I know I broke the rules by stepping forward. But Dad, that man was being so mean to the guard, and nobody was stopping him, and I just thought—" "You thought someone should stand up for him," Catherine finished, sitting on his other side and taking his hand. "And you were absolutely right, darling." George looked up, surprised. "I am not in trouble?" William put his arm around his son's shoulders. "You are not in trouble, George. What you did today was brave and kind. It was exactly what a future king should do. But we need to talk about what happens next because the whole world is talking about this and your life might feel different for a while." George nodded slowly, trying to understand. At 10 years old, he could not fully grasp that he had just become a global symbol of courage and compassion. He could not know that his actions would be studied in schools, discussed in boardrooms, and remembered for generations. He only knew that he had seen someone being treated badly, and he had tried to help. "Am I going to have to give a speech or something?" George asked nervously. Public speaking was not his favorite thing, though he had been training for it since he was young. Catherine smiled and brushed his hair back from his forehead. "No speech is required, my love. But you might find that people recognize you more now when we go out, and they are going to be watching to see what kind of person you become. Today, you showed them something beautiful. You showed them that being royal is not just about crowns and ceremonies. It is about service and standing up for what is right." William looked at his son with an expression of profound. 3 days after the incident, James Mitchell received an unexpected phone call. He was at his parents' home in Manchester, having taken a few days of leave as the media frenzy around the event had made his normal duties complicated. The number on his phone showed as private, and when he answered, a polite voice asked if he was speaking with Guard James Mitchell of the Coldstream Guards. "Yes, this is he," James replied, wondering if it was another journalist trying to get an interview. He had already declined dozens of requests from newspapers, television shows, and online media outlets. His commanding officer had advised him to keep a low profile and let the attention die down naturally. "Please hold for His Royal Highness." "The Prince of Wales," the voice said, and James nearly dropped his phone. A moment later, Prince William's voice came through, warm and genuine. "Guard Mitchell, I hope I am not disturbing you. I wanted to reach out personally to thank you for your service and to apologize for what you endured outside the palace. My son George has not stopped talking about you. He was wondering if perhaps you might be willing to visit us at Kensington Palace. We would very much like to meet you properly." James stood in his parents' small living room, his mother watching him with curious eyes, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. "Your Royal Highness, that would be an incredible honor," he managed to say. "And there is no need to apologize. I was just doing my duty. Your son, he is the one who showed real courage that day. What he did, standing up like that, it meant more than I can express." They arranged a private meeting for the following week. When James told his mother what had happened, she burst into tears and immediately called everyone she knew. Her son, her James, who had always been such a good boy, was going to have tea with the future king and the young prince who had defended him. It seemed like something from a fairy tale. The meeting was kept completely private, with no media presence and only essential palace staff aware of it. On a quiet Tuesday morning, James arrived at Kensington Palace in his dress uniform, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his nerves making his hands shake slightly. He was escorted through beautiful corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens from centuries past, until he reached a comfortable sitting room where the family was waiting. Prince George saw him first and his face lit up with recognition. He stood immediately, walking forward with his hand extended in a gesture he had been taught since early childhood. "Guard Mitchell, it is wonderful to meet you properly," he said, shaking James's hand with surprising firmness for such a young boy. James was struck by how different George seemed in person, compared to seeing him from behind the barriers at the palace. He was just a kid, friendly and a bit shy, with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle manner. "Your Royal Highness, I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude," James said, his military training helping him find the right words despite his emotions. "What you did that day, speaking up for me, it was one of the most honorable things I have ever witnessed." William and Catherine greeted him warmly, and they all sat down for tea. For the next hour, they talked like normal people, though the setting was anything but normal. George asked James about being a guard, about the training, about how hard it was to stand so still for so long. James told stories about his time in the military, about his family, about why he had chosen to serve. "Do people try to make you laugh a lot?" George asked, genuinely curious. James smiled. "All the time, Your Highness. That is part of the job. Most people are just having fun, and we understand that. But sometimes, like that day, it goes too far. We are trained to never react no matter what. But I will be honest with you. It can be difficult. That man that day, he was not just trying to be funny. He was being cruel." George nodded seriously. "That is why I had to say something. My great-grandmother told me that when you see cruelty, you cannot just look away. You have to stand up against it, even if it is scary." Catherine reached over and gently squeezed her son's shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. William looked at James and said, "My son has always had a strong sense of fairness. But what he did that day, we had no idea he had that kind of courage in him. You helped him discover something about himself, you know. You gave him an opportunity to be brave." James shook his head respectfully. "With all due respect, Your Royal Highness, that courage was already there. I just happened to be the one he used it for. If anything, your son reminded me why I do this job. He reminded everyone watching that service matters, that respect matters, that standing up for what is right matters, regardless of who you are or how old you are." Before James left, George presented him with something unexpected. It was a hand-drawn picture, clearly created by George himself, showing a guard standing tall with a small figure beside him. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, it read, "Thank you for your service. You are a hero. From George." James accepted the drawing with trembling hands, completely overwhelmed. "Your Highness, I will treasure this forever," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Thank you. Thank you so much." As James was escorted out, George called after him, "Guard Mitchell, will I see you at the palace again? When you are on duty?" James turned and smiled. "Yes, Your Highness. I will be back at my post next week." "Good," George said with a grin. "I will make sure nobody bothers you. I promise." Everyone laughed, and the warmth of that moment seemed to fill the entire room. It was a reminder that despite all the formality and protocol that usually surrounded the royal family, they were people with genuine feelings and the capacity for real friendship. The meeting was never officially announced to the public, but somehow word leaked out, as things often do in the digital age. Someone on the palace staff mentioned it to a friend, who mentioned it to someone else, and within days it was being reported in newspapers worldwide. The story of the private meeting between the prince and the guard he had defended captured hearts all over again. It showed that George's actions had not been a one-time performance for cameras but a genuine expression of his character. Schools around the world began incorporating the incident into their curriculum. In Canada, a high school started a program called the Prince George Project, where students were encouraged to stand up against bullying and document their acts of courage. In Australia, a youth organization created awards named after the young prince for children who showed exceptional bravery in defending others. In America, a best-selling children's book was written about the incident, with all proceeds going to military charities. The drunk men who had harassed Guard Mitchell faced their own consequences. They were identified through the viral videos and banned from all royal properties. One of them, the main instigator, lost his job when his employer saw his behavior online. He issued a public apology video that was widely shared, though many felt it came too late and was motivated more by the negative consequences he faced than genuine remorse. More importantly, the incident sparked real conversations about public behavior and respect. Tourism agencies began including information in their materials about proper conduct around ceremonial guards. Signs were put up at Buckingham Palace and other royal sites, reminding visitors that the guards were active military personnel, deserving of respect. Security protocols were reviewed and strengthened to better protect the guards from harassment. Guard Mitchell returned to his duties the following week, and the first time he took his position at Buckingham Palace after the incident, something remarkable happened. As he stood in formation, the crowd that had gathered was noticeably different. People watched quietly and respectfully. Parents told their children about the importance of respecting the guards. Several people in the crowd even started applauding the guards, thanking them for their service. One elderly veteran, wearing his old military medals on his jacket, approached the barrier and stood at attention, saluting Guard Mitchell. "Thank you for your service, son," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "And thank you to the young prince who reminded us all what respect looks like." The moment was captured on dozens of phones, and soon another video was trending, this one showing the transformed atmosphere around the guards. The hashtag #RespectTheGuards began trending, with people sharing their own photos and videos of properly honoring the ceremonial guards, not just in London but at similar posts around the world. In his modest apartment that evening, James carefully framed George's drawing and hung it on his wall. He stood back and looked at it, thinking about how one moment, one act of courage from a 10-year-old boy had changed so many things. It had changed how people viewed the guards. It had changed how people thought about the royal family. It had changed his own life in ways he was still trying to understand, but perhaps most importantly, it had shown the world something powerful and true. That kindness and courage were not determined by age or position or wealth. That standing up for what was right was something anyone could do if they chose to be brave. That sometimes the smallest voice could make the biggest difference. James picked up his phone and typed a simple message. "Your Royal Highness, thank you again for today. You reminded me why I wear this uniform. You reminded a lot of people about a lot of important things. The world is lucky to have you." He sent it to the private Noom. 6 months after the incident, the effects were still rippling outward like waves from a stone thrown into a pond. In a small town in Ohio, a 12-year-old girl named Emma watched the video of Prince George for probably the 100th time. She had been dealing with a bully at school who made fun of a boy with autism in her class. For months, Emma had wanted to say something but was too afraid of becoming the next target. The day after watching the video again, Emma walked up to the bully in the school cafeteria. Her hands were shaking and her voice was not as steady as Prince George's had been, but she spoke up anyway. "What you are doing to Marcus is not okay," she said, her classmates turning to watch. "He deserves respect just like everyone else, and if you have a problem with him, you will have a problem with me too." The bully was so surprised that someone had confronted her that she just stood there, speechless. Other students began standing up, joining Emma, forming a protective circle around Marcus. The teacher on lunch duty witnessed the whole thing, and later called Emma's parents to tell them how proud they should be. Emma's mother cried when she heard the story, and that night at dinner, Emma told her family about the prince who had inspired her to be brave. "I kept thinking," Emma explained, "if a prince can stand up to a grown man who is being mean to a guard, then I can stand up to a bully in my school. If he can do it, I can do it." Stories like Emma's were happening everywhere. In Japan, a young man stood up to colleagues who were harassing a coworker. In South Africa, a teacher intervened when she saw a student being excluded by classmates. In Brazil, a teenager defended an elderly person being treated rudely on a bus. People from all walks of life, inspired by what they had seen that day in London, were finding their own courage to speak up against injustice. The incident had also profoundly affected how people viewed the royal family, particularly the younger generation of royals. For years, there had been debates about the relevance of monarchy in the modern world. Some argued that it was an outdated institution with no real purpose. But Prince George's actions had reminded people that royalty could be more than just ceremony and tradition. It could be about genuine service and leadership, by example. Public opinion polls showed a dramatic increase in support for the monarchy, particularly among younger people who had previously been indifferent or critical. When asked why their opinions had changed, many pointed to Prince George's actions as evidence that the royal family still had an important role to play in setting moral examples and inspiring positive behavior. At Buckingham Palace, the king himself was deeply moved by his great-grandson's actions. He invited George for a private lunch, just the two of them, in his private study. The king was known for being somewhat formal and reserved, but with George, he was warm and grandfatherly. Your great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, once said that we must live our lives in such a way that when others see us, they see what is good and right, the king told George as they ate sandwiches together. You did that, my boy, without even trying. Without even knowing the cameras were there. You showed the world what it means to be a leader, not through power or authority, but through simple human decency. George, who had felt overwhelmed by all the attention, found comfort in his great-grandfather's words. But I did not do anything special, Granddad, he said quietly. I just said what I thought was right. Anyone could have done the same thing. The king smiled and leaned forward. But they did not, George. That is the point. Hundreds of people stood there and did nothing. You chose to act. That is what makes a true leader. Not the crown on your head someday, but the courage in your heart right now. Meanwhile, Guard Mitchell's life had changed in unexpected ways. He had been promoted to Lance Corporal, partly due to the attention the incident had brought to the professionalism of the guards. More importantly, he had been asked to speak at military academies about duty, honor, and the importance of ceremonial roles in the armed forces. James, who had never considered himself a public speaker, discovered that he had a gift for connecting with young soldiers and helping them understand the deeper meaning of their service. At one such event at Sandhurst Military Academy, James shared his perspective with a room full of officer cadets. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace, you are taught that you are a symbol, he told them. You represent the monarchy, the military, the nation. But that day when Prince George defended me, I realized something important. We are not just symbols. We are people. And the greatest honor of service is when someone recognizes your humanity while you are doing your duty. He paused, looking at the young faces watching him intently. That young prince could have walked away. He could have let the adults handle it. But he saw a person being treated badly, and he chose to stand up. If a 10-year-old can show that kind of moral courage, what excuse do we have as trained military officers not to do the same? The cadets gave him a standing ovation, and several approached him afterward to say that his words had changed how they viewed their future roles as leaders. One young woman, training to be an officer in the Royal Engineers, told him with tears in her eyes that she had been questioning whether she belonged in the military. But your story, and what that prince did, it reminded me why I joined. It is about serving others and standing up for what is right. Thank you for that reminder. Back at their school, George was trying to adjust to his new reality. His classmates treated him differently now, which bothered him more than the global attention. Some seemed afraid to talk to him, as if he had suddenly become too important to approach casually. Others wanted to be his friend specifically because of what had happened, which felt wrong to George somehow. During lunch one day, he sat alone, picking at his food and feeling isolated. His best friend, a boy named Thomas, who had known him since they were small, finally walked over and sat down beside him. You know, you are still just George to me, Thomas said simply. You are still the same person who helped me with my maths homework and who laughs at terrible jokes. What you did was brilliant, but it does not change who you are to your real friends. George looked at Thomas with relief flooding through him. Thank you, he said quietly. Sometimes I feel like people only see that one moment now, not all the rest of me. That is because people are daft, Thomas said with a grin. Come on, let's go play football. And if you try to use your prince status to call yourself referee again, I am telling your mum. George laughed, genuinely laughed for the first time in weeks, and they ran off to join the other boys on the field. It was a small moment, but it reminded him that real friendship was not about titles or fame. It was about people who saw you for who you truly were and liked you anyway. Catherine watched from a distance, her heart both breaking and healing at the same time. She had worried so much about how the incident would affect George's normal childhood, but seeing him laugh with his friend, seeing him just be a boy playing football on a sunny afternoon, she realized that her son had an inner strength that would carry him through whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, the family gathered for dinner as they always did, insisting on this time together no matter how busy their schedules were. Princess Charlotte, George's younger sister, looked at her brother across the table and said, "George, my teacher showed your video in class today. She said you were very brave." George groaned and put his head in his hands. "Not you too, Charlotte. Can we please talk about something else? Anything else?" Prince Louis, the youngest, piped up helpfully. "We could talk about my drawing of a dinosaur eating a castle. It is much more interesting than George being on the internet." Everyone laughed, and William reached over to ruffle George's hair. "You heard the boy. Dinosaurs eating castles are definitely more interesting. Tell us about this dinosaur, Louis." As Louis launched into an enthusiastic and completely incoherent description of his artwork, George felt the tension leave his shoulders. This was what he needed. Not praise or attention, but just his family being normal, treating him like he was still just George. Still just their son and brother. Later that night, as Catherine tucked him into bed, George asked her a question that had been bothering him. "Mum, do you think people will forget about what happened? Will things go back to normal?" Catherine sat on the edge of his bed and thought carefully about her answer. "I think people will always remember it, darling," she said honestly. "But that is not a bad thing. You did something that mattered, something that reminded people to be kinder and braver. That is a good legacy to have. But you are right that it should not define your entire life. You are so much more than one moment, no matter how important that moment was. What if I cannot live up to it?" George asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing in his heart. "What if people expect me to always be brave and perfect and I let them down?" Catherine leaned down and kissed his forehead. "My darling boy, you are 10 years old. You are allowed to be scared sometimes. You are allowed to make mistakes. Being brave does not mean never being afraid. It means doing the right thing even when you are afraid. And as for being perfect, nobody is perfect, not even princes. Especially not princes, if you ask some people." George smiled at that. "Was Dad scared when he was young? Your father?" 1 year after the incident, on a warm August morning, George stood in his room at Kensington Palace getting dressed. Today was special, not because of any official ceremony or royal duty, but because of something he had asked to do himself. He wanted to return to Buckingham Palace, to stand in the crowd like a normal person again, and to watch the changing of the guard ceremony on the anniversary of the day that had changed so much. His parents had been hesitant at first, worried about the attention it might draw. But George had been insistent. "I need to go back, Mum," he had explained. "I need to see that everything is okay, that the guards are being treated with respect. And I want Guard Mitchell to know that I did not forget about what happened or about him." So arrangements had been made, though this time with significantly more security presence. The palace had also quietly informed the media that the Prince of Wales and his family would be making a private visit to observe the ceremony, asking for respectful distance. Surprisingly, most media outlets had agreed, perhaps understanding that some moments deserve to be less about spectacle and more about genuine reflection. As the family arrived at the palace, George noticed immediately how different things felt. There were still crowds of tourists, still excitement and cameras, but there was also something else. People were being more respectful. Parents were teaching their children about the guard service. Signs had been placed around the area reminding visitors that the guards were active military personnel. The atmosphere had shifted from pure entertainment to something that honored tradition and service. George stood in the crowd with his father's hand on his shoulder, watching as the ceremony began. The precision, the history, the dedication of the guard seemed even more impressive to him now than it had a year ago. He understood better what these men and women were doing, the discipline it required, the honor they brought to their service. And then he saw Guard Mitchell, standing in formation as professional and stoic as ever. George felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was his friend, this guard who had shown him what quiet courage looked like. James could not acknowledge him, of course, could not break his stance to wave or smile, but George liked to think that James knew he was there, that their friendship extended beyond words or gestures. After the ceremony concluded, George was escorted to a private room where James met him. Now out of his ceremonial uniform and able to speak freely, they embraced like old friends, which in many ways they had become through their letters over the past year. "You came back," James said, his voice filled with emotion. "I did not know if you would." "Of course I came back," George replied. "This day matters, not because of what happened to me, but because of what it meant to so many people. My father says that when something important happens, you should mark it, remember it, learn from it." William, who had accompanied George into the private meeting, extended his hand to James. "Lance Corporal Mitchell, it is good to see you again. My son speaks of you often. I think you have become something of a role model for him, which is quite an honor." James shook his head humbly. "Your Royal Highness, it is your son who is the role model. The changes I have seen this past year, the kindness and respect that people are showing not just to the guards but to each other in general, it all traces back to what Prince George did that day. He showed people that standing up for others is not just the right thing to do, it is the necessary thing to do." Catherine joined them, and for the next hour, they talked like friends rather than royals and subjects. James shared stories of the young soldiers he had been mentoring, many of them inspired to join the military specifically because of what they had seen a year ago. George told James about the letters he had received from children around the world, kids who had found the courage to stand up to bullies or defend classmates because they had seen his example. "I got a letter from a girl in Australia," George said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "She wrote to say that she used to watch people being mean to others and did nothing because she was scared. But after seeing what I did, she stood up for a boy in her class who was being excluded because he used a wheelchair. She said that watching the video made her realize that being scared is okay, but letting fear stop you from helping others is not okay." James listened with tears in his eyes. "That is extraordinary, Your Highness. One moment of courage has created thousands of other moments of courage. That is the kind of leadership the world needs." Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Word had spread among the guards and military personnel at Buckingham Palace that Prince George was visiting on the anniversary of the incident. A group of about 30 guards, both those currently serving at the palace and others who had specifically requested to be there, gathered in formation in a private courtyard. When George and his family were brought to the courtyard, the guards stood at attention. Their commanding officer, a stern but kind man named Colonel Patterson, stepped forward and addressed the young prince. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carrying the weight of military formality, but also genuine warmth. "On behalf of all the men and women of the King's Guard, we wish to express our deepest gratitude for your actions 1 year ago. You defended one of our own when he could not defend himself. You reminded the world that behind these uniforms are real people serving with honor and dedication. You gave dignity to our service in a way that no amount of ceremony or tradition could achieve." He nodded to the formation, and as one, all 30 guards saluted Prince George. It was a moment of such profound respect and gratitude that everyone present felt its weight. George, just 11 years old now, stood straight and returned the salute as he had been taught, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," George said, his young voice breaking slightly, "but I think I should be saluting you. All of you. You serve our country with such honor. You stand there day after day doing your duty, and you deserve so much more respect than you receive. If I helped remind people of that, then I am grateful. But you are the real heroes, not me." The guards remained at attention, but there was a visible shift in their bearing. Pride, recognition, appreciation. These emotions rarely had a place in military formality, but in this moment they were undeniable. As the family prepared to leave, Guard Mitchell walked with them to their car. He had something he wanted to give George. It was a small patch, the insignia of the Coldstream Guards mounted in a frame with an inscription that read, "To Prince George, who showed us the true meaning of service and courage. From the Guards you defended and inspired. August 2024. This comes from all of us," James explained. Everyone who serves, everyone who has served, everyone who will serve in the future. We wanted you to have something to remember that your actions mattered, that they will always matter. George accepted the gift with reverence, holding it carefully. I will keep this forever, he promised. And whenever I look at it, I will remember that being brave is not about being strong or powerful. It is about standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet. George sat between his parents, the framed patch on his lap, processing everything that had happened. William looked at his son and saw not just the child he was, but glimpses of the man and king he would become. A leader who understood service, who valued human dignity, who would not stand by while others were mistreated. I am proud of you, George, William said simply. Not just for what you did a year ago, but for who you are becoming. Your great-grandmother would be so proud to see the kind of person you are growing into. George leaned against his father's shoulder. Do you think I will have to give speeches about this forever? Everyone always wants me to talk about it. William laughed softly. Probably, yes. Important moments tend to follow you around. But here's what I have learned. You do not talk about it to brag or to remind people of what you did. You talk about it to remind people of what they can do. Every time you tell that story, you give someone else permission to be brave. That is the real power of what happened. That evening, news outlets around the world ran stories marking the one-year anniversary of the incident. The original video was shared millions of times again, introducing a new generation to the story. Television programs did special features on how the event had inspired positive changes in communities worldwide. Schools that had implemented anti-bullying programs inspired by Prince George's actions shared their success stories. In Manchester, James Mitchell's parents watched the news coverage in their living room, seeing their son being interviewed about the anniversary and the ongoing friendship he had developed with the young prince. His mother wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed with pride not just for her son, but for the remarkable young royal who had defended him. That boy is going to be a wonderful king someday, she said to her husband, not because of his title but because of his heart. Around the world, similar conversations were happening. In living rooms and classrooms, in military barracks and palace halls, people reflected on what one moment of courage had taught them. That age was not a barrier to bravery. That titles and positions were less important than character and compassion. That sometimes the smallest person in the room,